Back for Blood. It's been roughly a year since its rough launch and its very poorly thought out first few patches. Yeah, between the November melee funeral and speedrun tactics just evaporating.
I'm dead!
2001 was not a good year for this game, but that was then, and this is now. And speaking of now, is Back for Blood in a better place? Yes, and it has been for a few months now. Have they brought back the speedrunning strats? No, and they probably never will. Have they at least fixed melee?
Actually, yes, but it's restricted.
If those were the only 3 questions you wanted answered, there you go. Speedrunning will probably never return to what it was, but the core game is much better, and melee builds actually work so long as you slip in a stamina card or 2. But I imagine more than a few of you would like more than that. I won't be going over the entire history of all the changes this game has. WowSuchGaming already did that. Instead, using my IQ of 9 billion, I have decided to instead make a short-form video going over the differences of the game's current state, so that way any new or returning players can decide if it's worth picking this game up. Also, for the sake of newer players especially, I'll be dividing this into 3 sections. First, going over what the core game has now, then going over content that requires you to own the DLC, and then going over what simply requires someone that you play with to have the DLC. I also won't be addressing the Swarm mode. It's seen some balance changes, but it's otherwise no different. Without further ado, let's begin. Players no longer draw cards 1 by 1 per level, but instead get all 15 cards at the start of any given run. This means that the decks you build are no longer you building a progression system, but are now building a makeshift class. This also fixes some of the issues with the gameplay. You're no longer miserably underpowered at the start of a run, more abilities have synergy with each other, and you don't have to wait till the end of a campaign to have all of your abilities. Cards themselves have also been rebalanced. Generally speaking, there's just not many downsides unless the card is particularly powerful. Many cards that initially gave weaker buffs now give a series of smaller buffs to make up for that. Mobility has been split into 2 stats, movement, which is your walking speed, and your sprinting speed, so cards can affect one or the other. Also, there's no cards that take away your ability to sprint anymore. Cards themselves are now more common in the levels. There are 3 boxes that give random but free generic cards, while 5 intel boxes, the ones that give you the player cards, now spawn in each level. Also, all the player cards now cost 500 copper exactly. I think these intel boxes can give you the DLC cards even if you don't have the DLC, but I wasn't able to verify this. The game has also added legendary cards as of the Halloween update, giving you powerful perks for absolutely free. But only one member of the team can take them, and duplicates do not spawn, so you need to think about who benefits the most from them, unless you're playing single player, of course. And then there's the burn cards. These one-time use cards replace getting free generic cards between levels. Their effects can be anything from just giving yourself a little extra copper to another life per level. They're mostly meant for higher difficulties or to help recover from a particularly nasty level. They also give supply points a use once you unlock everything else in the core game. A 4th difficulty known as No Hope has been added to the game. Nightmare and Veteran have been slightly toned down, as some of the absurd elements of Nightmare were moved over to No Hope, and the same to Veteran the Nightmare. Honestly though, it's the ability to start with all 15 cards from the get-go that makes the game way more manageable. Also, while the game is more than happy to send more mutated infected at you than a single magazine of your gun will handle, the game no longer spawns 8+ mutated Ridden all at once. Apparently that was a bug. The other big difference in terms of difficulty are events, those moments when the game will flash a new card on screen to show a change to the rules. That can happen on any difficulty now. Though aside from No Hope, these are still location exclusive. The big change in terms of difficulty are the supply points, which have been boosted across the board. Recruit now earns 40 or more points at minimum, assuming everyone on the team survives. This value can often reach 70 or even 100 if the secondary objectives and bonuses are accounted for. Veteran gives a 75% boost to those earnings, with Nightmare giving 150% more supply points, and anybody who takes on No Hope gets 200% more. You can also get a supply point boost for matchmaking. Then there's also the Mementos, a set of little zombie Funko Pop things, in lack of a better way to put it, that give you extra supply points based on how many you find. The actual progression system itself, though, hasn't changed, but thankfully the god-awful grind that the game originally had, and that made progression a actual nightmare, has been nearly trivialized, for the core game at least. Survivor bots have been thankfully improved. While the pathfinding is still something the AI struggles with, especially when it comes to the common Ridden, They're no longer going to jump to their death at every given opportunity. Bots also no longer receive trauma damage to balance their limited means of avoiding damage compared to a human player. Bots are also capable of using grenade accessories and healing items, though they operate on timers to mimic the need of having to scavenge for them. This also means that they don't need to take items away from the world from players, though. In single player, bots can now be commanded to pick up and use toolkits, although these are one-time use items, not operating on a timer. Do note that the toolkit cannot be bought in the safe house and must be found naturally in the level. They can also be prompted to grab things like blood samples. Finally, the bots use a series of pre-built decks that the player can build their own deck around, which honestly makes Back 4 Blood a better single-player experience than its contemporaries, provided you don't do Act 3 on Nightmare or Act 4 in general. The final big change to the game are healing mechanics, and it's why the health bars look so different. The two new features are Bolstered Health and Overheal. Bolstered Health allows you to heal beyond your maximum, but only with temporary health. Overheal allows any medical accessory to contribute to this extra temporary health, but only up to a certain percent. Both of these stats are dictated strictly by cards, but it also means that players finally have a means to counter trauma damage other than don't get hit lol. On top of that, trauma damage is a little easier to recover. Also, first aid cabinets have received a minor buff, 4 free uses on Recruit, 2 on Veteran, 1 on Nightmare. On top of an expansion to healing, the game has also introduced some new items with the second DLC expansion that anybody can use regardless if they have said DLC. A smoke grenade that hides cleaners from the infected, a bait jar that's similar to the bile jar from Left 4 Dead 2. It only summons a handful of additional zombies to attack at best, but it also slows down enemies and limits their mobility to compensate. A bow and arrow which has unlimited ammo, but very limited range. It consumes your stamina to fire and causes enemies to suffer bleed damage when hit. And finally, Iron Claws, rapid melee weapons that deal limited damage but inflict stacking bleed damage with every hit. Makeshift armor can be found in levels or bought in safe house vendors. These block heavy attacks, negating the damage as the armor breaks. They do nothing against common Ridden, they don't negate knockback, and they don't help when you're pinned. The player can stack up to 4 armor plates at a time, and armor resets between levels. Copper piles are no longer bigger to denote size. The large copper pile asset is now used for what's called warped copper. This gives 100 copper to you and you alone should you pick it up, but you'll also take an extra 5% damage until the end of that level, and that will stack. Players now have a means of removing attachments. In the safe house, players can unbolt a gun for 500 copper. That gun will then be unbolted until you get a new one. That copy of the gun can then have as many attachments removed as the player wants for the rest of the run. A card was added at the same time of this feature that lets the player do it anywhere, and it makes the action a little cheaper to boot. Unbolting can also be used to fix broken attachments. There's also food items in the game now. There's 5 in total. Peaches instantly recover 5 health and 5 trauma, while the other 4 give small but stackable perks that last for the rest of the level. The game has introduced new corruption cards with each DLC update. While some can only be found within DLC levels or once the DLC is purchased and active, there are 6 noteworthy additions to the base game. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory though 2 stand out. First is Cost of Avarice, which makes it so the player's copper actually weighs them down during the levels, and almost all spawns in the level are replaced with warped copper. The second is Break Time, which adjusts the gameplay to be more in line with Call of Duty or Battlefield. Low health values and faster bleed out when you're downed, but you take no trauma damage, your health regenerates if you don't get hurt long enough, and you have some extra lives throughout the level. On top of that, all of the speedrunning challenges have been removed from the game. Probably because removing speedrunning strats to get rid of griefing but then leaving in cards that demand you speedrun to get paid would have been incredibly stupid.
No shit.
Turtle Rock has made an effort to address some of the complaints about the dialogue. They haven't removed or re-recorded any of the existing dialogue, so anything you found cringe-inducing the first time is still somewhere in the game. But they've greatly expanded the variety of lines characters have, as much as 3 or 4 times as much, and they've also added more serious dialogue. All of the characters have dialogue that reference their past lives before the collapse. On top of that, the humor's just better this time around. A lot more of it is based in the situation and is observations on what's actually happening, instead of just non-stop random quips. So, while the dialogue hasn't changed much, the game is also no longer a series of non-stop battle royale victory quotes. This has helped This has helped Holly and Evangelo the most. The former now properly feels like someone using humor as a coping mechanism for what's going on, while the latter seems to genuinely not appreciate the danger he's actually in. Christine and Hoffman are still the best characters, though. Finally, for whoever this may concern, Turtle Rock Studios has kept their promise. Back 4 Blood has no microtransactions to this day. The battle-hardened outfits are sadly only available to people who purchase the stupidly expensive Ultimate version of the game, as they are currently not available as a standalone purchase. Shame really, they're some of the better cosmetics in the game. The first expansion comes with 2 additional characters. Heng, who was completely reworked as of the Halloween update to operate around the new food mechanic. Having him on the team spawns 10 more food items on each level. Heng also gains a copy of any food effects someone on the team eats, meaning he himself gets double the effect when he eats it. Heng also recovers 1 point of trauma whenever he consumes food, and the entire team recovers a point of stamina and health whenever they eat. It'll also boost the maximums for both of those stats by 1 for the rest of that level. Finally, Heng can sense intel boxes through walls. This is the only leftover of his original playstyle. By comparison, Charisse is a lot more straightforward. She gives the team the ability to turn armor shot off Ridden into makeshift armor, on top of giving the team 25% bolstered health. Charisse herself also has a natural 25% trauma resistance. Owning the first expansion pass also gives all 8 of the original cleaners of the game their own hazmat suits. And credit where it's due, they don't just recolor the same suit 8 times, they actually have different elements to each of them. And finally, there's a set of weapon skins known as the Biohazard skins, available for all melee weapons, most assault rifles, the non-sawed-off shotguns, the RPK light machine gun, and the Tech 9 machine pistol. The second pass gives players access to Dan the False Prophet. Initially, his only perk is his screwdriver, meaning his bash attack does enhanced damage without the need of the combat knife. However, his real perks are with reviving. Dan himself gets combat buffs whenever a teammate goes down, and the team receives perks for the rest of the level whenever a teammate is successfully revived. That being said, it can also just spawn a series of grenades to offer you cover or blast away enemies. How the teammate goes down and who brings them up doesn't matter. The general mentality of the new characters is that Heng makes recovery easier, Charisse aids in defense, and Dan serves as the life insurance policy. The costumes this time are the pre-collapse set, a series of outfits that give a peek into the lives of the characters before, well, all this went down. A noteworthy detail is that Heng and Christine are visibly younger with theirs, although this doesn't affect their voices in the slightest. Humorously enough, the prepper, Hoffman, doesn't have one, because he was no different before all this happened. That's actually kind of funny. And the gun skin for the second expansion is 8-Bit Blitz, a set of Atari and NES-inspired skins for melee weapons, the primary SMGs, the sawed-off primary shotgun, and the Phoenix 350L sniper rifle. At the time of this video, the third DLC pack is not out, nor has any information about it been released. Instead of offering traditional levels, the Tunnels of Terror adds Ridden hives. These cannot be selected in the menu, and instead a hive entrance must be discovered during a run. There's a 10% chance of an entrance being in any given level, with the exception of finales. Once everyone gathers at a hive entrance, it counts the level as having been successfully finished, but you won't know which of the 6 levels you're actually entering. On top of that, there's an inner layer that may or may not even spawn within the hives. These serve as a series of boss battles or zombie horde rushes. You can only open one area at a time, so hope for the best and be ready for the worst as you try to find the exits and the other skulls. Speaking of which, the main reason to enter these in the long run is the skull totems. These can be traded for cards and cosmetics, but I'll get to that in a minute. In the hives themselves, they have to be manually carried out like a gas can or a propane tank. You don't have to drop your weapons to carry it, but it also means you can't holster them. It does have the attack of the fire axe, so you're not defenseless with it. Melee perks apply to it as well, so if your team has a designated melee user, let them carry it. Exactly 3 skulls spawn in each hive, regardless of the difficulty, and the players can combine them onto a single totem. It makes it easier to carry and increases the damage of the totem, but the attacks slow down and it uses more stamina for each attack. If the player should fall to their death in the cuts or the sunken passages, the skull is lost and will not respawn. With the exception of the sunken passages, every hive has exits earlier in the level if the players want to cut their losses and escape, but you will almost always miss out on skulls when you do so. Also, inner layers can appear before it's possible to get all the skulls, and it may not be possible to backtrack to the inner layer entrance after you get them. Once you cash out the skulls, you can access the collector's supply run at any time, even without the DLC. The cards are in the front of each supply line and only cost 2 skulls, so it's fairly easy to get them even if you don't have the DLC yourself. However, you will still have to wait for each line to rotate out. And since you unfortunately still have to buy everything in order, and the items you buy will be replaced with burn cards if it rotates out before you get everything, you're honestly better off waiting until you can get 30 or so skulls and buying each line in bulk if you want the cosmetics, especially those costumes at the end. There are reasons to enter these hives beyond the skulls. On top of being able to finish other levels earlier, Ridden hives still spawn copper and supplies, and you get bonuses for surviving to the end, so teams can use them as a chance to stock up or earn some extra copper between levels if they're good enough. This can be a literal lifesaver on Nightmare. Then there's the warp chests. These will inflict a team-wide debuff for the rest of the level, but spawn weapons of much higher caliber than what you would find on the surface at that point. On top of that, you get free accessories, attachments, and a free generic intel box. There's also legendary versions of other weapons, attachments, and accessories that only spawn in these boxes. As of the Halloween update, you can use a toolkit to safely open them without any debuffs applying. Finally, a new subversion of each infected class can be found in any given level once this DLC is acquired. They can be easily identified by their spike-covered backs and their sunlight-deprived flesh. The Urchin can spit spiked balls of what I hope is web that cling to any surface and damage anyone who gets too close to them. The Shredder will cause an implosion that draws other cleaners into it, and it has melee attacks that cover players in pus that slows them down. Unlike the other fatties, it doesn't explode when it dies, but instead leaks acid before healing over. The Ripper can unleash a series of spikes that travel on the ground and even up certain surfaces, giving it more range than the other Tallboy variants. Overall, the first expansion pass is more of an addition and an evolution to the gameplay loop, rather than a new set of levels or content to explore. The second DLC pass gives access to Act 5. The 6th level campaign sees cleaners breaking into a prison overrun by cultists, who have effectively become halfway between a human and a zombie, attempting to free their captives before escaping themselves. Level design-wise, Act 5 offers a better balance of open and enclosed spaces, and brings in more of going in and out of rooms to loot for supplies, while still offering bottlenecks for crowd control. Cleaners also have an inexhaustible supply of door busters for this campaign, allowing players to break open locked doors besides the prepper stashes, but this will aggro any wandering Ridden. The big gameplay addition this time are the cultists, snipers, who do exactly what you think they do, crones who use bow and arrows that will light you on fire if enough of them manage to land on you, pus flingers, could they really not come up with a better name for that one? Can't directly hurt you, but use their bait jars to attract Ridden and utterly decimate your stamina. Slashers are the big threat. They're bulky, armored, and a bit quicker than you might think. Their attacks also do a stacking amount of bleed damage, and they attack faster and faster the more they're around you. On higher difficulties, a single one can kill you. Much like the warped Ridden of the first expansion, cultists can appear outside of Act 5. However, presumably because they're more dangerous than the standard mutations, they won't be regularly spawning outside of Act 5 until you go to Nightmare. The other big threat you need to look out for Act 5 are simply bear traps. Same applies to any Ridden hives you find in Act 5. They will, well, trap the player in place, and they start to apply bleed damage until either you or a teammate can free yourself. Use speed determines how fast you can be freed from a bear trap. The big collectible this time are duffel bags. One spawns per level, strictly in Act 5, now with a beeper and an outline so you can hear and see when one's near. Gameplay-wise, they function like the blood samples in the core game. Take them to the end of the safe house and you get your free item. In that sense, they're like a loot box. It'll prioritize any cards you don't have yet before it starts giving cosmetics, and once you get all the cards and cosmetics that they have to offer, you'll start getting burn cards. And that's actually it. The second pass is much more straightforward. Another 6 levels, and honestly some of the better levels in Back 4 Blood, alongside some new enemies to fight. Now that you're all caught up with the state of Back 4 Blood, allow me to give some perspective. The original Left 4 Dead was okay, but mostly held up by the novelty of its genre. But there were only 6 enemies in the game, only 6 guns, only 4 campaigns, and the versus mode could only be played on 2 of them. And on top of that, no survival mode at launch either. Even with the variation that the AI director brought in, it wouldn't take long for Left 4 Dead to become a been there, done that situation. And I really do think it is the speed that Left 4 Dead 2 came out with that stopped people from getting burnt out on it so quickly. And World War Z, that was a shell of a game at launch. No 5 skull setting, no virus samples, no daily or weekly challenges, only 4 campaigns, and 3 of them had 1 less level each. No bomber, no booster, no infector, no rat pack, no special weapon variations, no Vanguard or Drone Master, no Horde mode, no crossplay, wasn't even on Steam originally. I could go on, but you get the point. Most of World War Z's praise comes from the fact that people's first experience was the update years after it came out, not the game it launched as. Now, you could point out that these facts are completely irrelevant now, since the versions we play are not the versions that launched, and I absolutely agree. But I would also say the same thing applies to Back 4 Blood at this point. What the game launched as, or what its initial ad campaign was, while neither were good, is not the game that you would currently be playing. I don't know if I can say Back 4 Blood has completely made its comeback, but at the start of 2022, it was one of the most disappointing modern games I've played. As of October, it is the game I've put the most time into.